Welcome to this evening's presentation in the Wisconsin Idea Lecture Series. Let me first introduce myself so you will understand why I'm standing here. I am Eric Sandgren, a professor at the School of Veterinary Medicine, and 2 years ago I was the faculty of record for this course. I just liked it so much, I keep hanging around. I'm part of the organizing committee and work with the discussion sections. Dr. Merritt asked me to give the introduction in her place tonight due to the inherent uncertainty in airplane travel plans. She did make it, as it turns out, and I'm glad she can be here. But I have to admit that to replace her is impossible. A number of you have been at these lectures for many years, and you know that she's just done an incredible job this year. Her contributions have really raised the bar for this course. And right at this point, I'd like us all to give her our acknowledgement for the tremendous job that she's been doing. Thank you, Nicole. There's one other shout out I would like to give, someone who's not here but probably is watching from his new home in Spain, and that's Patrick Brenzel. He developed this course and for all of the years was part of the organizing committee helping us refine our approach. And I'd like to say to you, Patrick, thanks again for everything. We're really trying to live up to your expectations. Patrick, call me. Tonight's topic is immigration, and as a lead into that, I would like to read something. This is the wording on a plaque called Our Shared Future, which will be placed in the Bascom Hill area once they finish digging it up to replace the sewer pipes. And the plaque says the following. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. I raise this to remind us all that we live on a land that has been inhabited by Native Americans for thousands of years. We've been here perhaps 1/30th as long as those people. For me personally, 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in Sweden, and the 4th was born here, but only 5 years after her parents arrived from Norway. Which probably explains a lot about me. But we're going to return now tonight to one of the themes of this series that we've talked about, starting with John Bascom, which is who constitutes the us or the we as we consider the supposed beneficiaries of the Wisconsin idea. For Bascom, Native Americans did not appear on that list. And over the years, the place of immigrants on that list has been highly variable. Currently, immigration has become a hugely politicized issue to the point that a pundit has blamed her party's losses on foreign-born voters, who of course would still be citizens if they were able to vote. Tonight's speaker is right in the thick of the current immigration controversy and has taken an active role at UW-Madison and elsewhere to extend the notion of common humanity to immigrants. Erin Barbato is the director of the Immigrant Justice Clinic at the University of Wisconsin Law School. She teaches second and third year law students to represent individuals in removal proceedings and with humanitarian-based immigration relief. Previously, Erin was executive director of and staff attorney at the Community Immigration Law Center in Madison. She's been formally recognized several times for her dedication to representing immigrants, and in particular, immigrant victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Currently, she is a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Wisconsin Bar Association, and remains on the board of the Community Immigration Law Center. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Erin Barbato.
Good evening, everyone. Can we hear me okay with the microphone? Good, good. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you all for being here to listen and to learn. A lot of what I do right now it's tough work. And really what I do if I go to the border or I go to detention facilities and some of the work I do in immigration court, I really want to make sure that I share that with people, because some of the work that I do, it's really hard to see the truth of what's going on. And so I was really excited to be invited and honored to be invited to speak here tonight, because so much of what I do at the Immigrant Justice Clinic was started through the Wisconsin idea. And I will talk about that a little bit. Please feel free to ask questions. And now that you are all experts in the Wisconsin idea, I'd love to hear feedback as well, because you probably all know much more about it as I do, and I'd love to continue to develop my role and relationship to the Wisconsin idea as I continue to teach and to practice law. So, let's see, there we go. Okay, so Bascom Hill. So we are located at the Immigrant Justice Clinic is a nonprofit located within the law school, and within the Economic Justice Institute. So we're our own 501c3. Part of our programming is supported by the law school, and some of it is based by with grant funding and with private donations. So we really run as a nonprofit and get support through the law school. The law school has this motto. It's called Law in Action. And it's something that I think really is intertwined with the Wisconsin idea. Wisconsin Law School, Law in Action, meaning that the students, while they learn in formal classes, there is a large emphasis on the practical learning and service to the community through Law in Action. So by the time the students, law school is 3 years, by the time they're in second and their third year of law school, many of them are going to court, many of them have clients, and they're all practicing under the law licenses of their professors. So my students, they appear in court, I sit next to them, and they have the power of me losing my law degree through the service that we offer to the community. But it's really to address social concerns and to have students really have this intense community connection while they're in law school, while they're still learning about the core classes in law as well. So we do a lot of work in detention facilities, prisons, as well as in court. The University of Wisconsin Law School is known for its clinical programs. So the clinical programs, this is a list of many of them. Many of them are associated with people that are incarcerated. And then one of our newest programs is the Immigrant Justice Clinic. So we only started in 2012. 2012, we started from a grant from a Baldwin grant, a Wisconsin Idea Endowment. And we received this funding to hopefully set up a permanent clinic at the law school, but they only gave us about 1 year of funding, and then we had to keep matching it for the next few years. And happily, we're still standing in, I'm not sure if we're happily standing, but we're still standing in 2019, because our work has changed substantially over the past 2 years, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, and how we respond to the needs of the immigrant community here in Wisconsin, outside of Wisconsin, in our nation, and also we're starting to work with people who are now living in other countries while waiting to seek asylum. But this Baldwin grant was, the application was a combination from a community organization as well as the Latinx Law Student Association at the law school, because they saw a need for services to be provided to the immigrant community in Wisconsin, because we didn't have a clinic in the law school that directly served our immigrant population. And why is this so important? So we all probably know that in criminal proceedings, if someone is charged with a crime, our government, because of the Sixth Amendment, will provide you with a lawyer if you can't afford a lawyer. But immigration proceedings, when I say immigration proceedings, it's called removal proceedings, but really more commonly known as deportation proceedings. Does our government provide you with an attorney? No. You can have an attorney. You have the right to have an attorney with you, but only if you can afford one or find a pro bono, someone to represent you pro bono. So regardless of your age, your country of origin, what you're applying for, you will not have an attorney representing you in court unless you can afford one or find a pro bono attorney. In 2012, we had no immigration attorneys in Dane County representing people in deportation proceedings on a pro bono basis. So people who were in removal proceedings in Dane County could hire an attorney, but that's $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 for the proceeding. And the consequences can be removal, deportation from your country, separation, permanent separation from your family, from your job, from the only country you may have ever known. So the stakes are high, the proceedings are complicated, and the pro bono services are lacking. So the community, along with the law school, came together to have this idea to represent people who are detained in removal proceedings, and I'll talk about the detention centers in Wisconsin in a minute, and also teach future lawyers how to become immigration attorneys. So when they graduate from law school, they're ready to represent people in immigration court when they graduate. And why is this so important? So studies have shown that when you're represented by an immigration attorney in deportation proceedings, if you're not detained at the time, you're 5 times more likely to receive relief from removal, meaning you're not going to be deported. If you're detained, 3 times more likely. So that's a huge difference for someone who is facing deportation from the United States. So I truly believe in the power of this, of having an attorney and the importance of it, but there aren't really government funding to have attorneys provide people representation, especially in detention. So nationally, from 2010 to 2015, immigrants without lawyers had an average success rate of 8% when in removal proceedings. So these are the most current statistics that we have. And then in Wisconsin, from 2010 to 2015, those who had lawyers were more than 6 times more likely to be allowed to remain in the United States. Nearly 55% of those with lawyers were allowed to stay, compared with 9% of the immigrants without attorneys. Okay, so I mentioned there are immigrant detention centers in Wisconsin. So you've probably all heard on the news about immigrant detention centers, a lot of them near the border. But we do detain people in immigration proceedings here in Wisconsin. There are 2 facilities. One is in Dodge County, about an hour from here, the Dodge County Correctional Facility, and then one in Kenosha County. So you can kind of see, the Kenosha kind of looks like the lake, but it's not. It's just blue. So there. And then Dodge right here. So both facilities have about 200 beds that are reserved for people in deportation proceedings. These are detention facilities, so it's general population. Many of the people in these facilities are people who are U.S. citizens who are serving their criminal sentences. Some of the people are immigrants who have already served their criminal sentence and are now in removal proceedings. And some of these people detained there are asylum seekers, people brought from our southern border who are now detained during the process of seeking asylum. Okay, so if you fled your country, let's say you fled Honduras and you arrived at our southern border to seek asylum in the United States because you were being persecuted in your home country, and then you were taken to Dodge County Correctional Facility, placed in removal proceedings, do you think you would have any financial means to hire an attorney? No. You haven't committed a crime. All you've done is sought protection under our laws, but you are then treated as if you committed a crime and been convicted of a crime and placed in detention center in Wisconsin. So right now, most of what we are doing at the Immigrant Justice Clinic is representing asylum seekers who are detained at Dodge County Correctional Facility. Because right now it feels like the most emergent situation for people, because if they're not represented by attorney, they're likely to be deported. But if they are represented by attorney, being under my law license with my students representing them, there's a good chance they may receive the relief that they should receive under our law. So this is law students in action in Wisconsin. And most of what we do is we do Know Your Rights consultations at Dodge County Correctional Facility. So one Friday every month, we go up to Dodge County, we meet with any of the 200 people that want to have a consultation with an attorney. On average, we meet with about 50 people. Of those people, we can represent one or two, because these cases are really complicated and the students are still learning. Now with the Community Immigration Law Center and funding that we do get from Dane County and the City of Madison, we have 2 additional immigration attorneys in Dane County that represent people in detention at Dodge County Correctional Facility. Both of those attorneys are graduates of the Immigrant Justice Clinic. So it's the Immigrant Justice Clinic only in the 7th year of beginning. We've already expanded the knowledge base of our community outside of the law school, which is really great. And then I get to work with my former students, which is selfishly really wonderful for me. Then we represent people in immigration court. Immigration court's in Chicago. So we either have to arrive at 8:30 in the morning in Chicago, so the law students get up super early. We drive down there and arrive for a 3 or 4 hour hearing, or sometimes they start at 1 p.m. The students can usually survive it. Me in my old age, I'm getting exhausted by these early mornings. But we have to go to Chicago. That's where we're going. And so it complicates the matter for everybody, especially for our clients, some of whom can't drive legally because they don't have driver's licenses. And then our clients that are detained at Dodge, they're woken up at about 3 in the morning and driven, handcuffed, shackled, down to Chicago to appear in court, where they appear in court in handcuffs in a prison uniform. Again, never have been convicted or charged with a crime. We do represent some detained individuals too in Wisconsin. A lot of people who are seeking asylum as well. So I want to really talk mostly about how we're representing people seeking asylum in the United States, because over the past 2 years, so much has changed in terms of the process of people applying for asylum. I want to highlight that no law has changed. Our legislature, Congress, has not acted to change any law, but through our executive branch, there have been some really powerful policy and regulations that have been put in place to change the fabric of our humanitarian asylum and refugee law, all of which really haven't changed since 1980. These are people who are seeking asylum because were victims of past persecution or fear of future persecution based on one of the enumerated grounds. So that would be race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. But we have been on our toes the past 2 years because we never know. Every week something changes. And the fabric of what we're doing really has changed. So just to get real basic about a few things, including my basic little drawings, which I did myself. Just the difference between refugees and asylees. Really, definitionally, they're the same. But refugees get this status outside of the United States. The United Nations is normally who qualifies this person as a refugee. So they've demonstrated that they are qualify as a refugee and then will maybe be placed in another country, a country that accepts them and can live there as a refugee and then get permanent status. These are asylum seekers. So you can seek asylum if you're in the United States. So maybe you've come into the United States without permission, or maybe you are a student here and something has changed in your country that now makes it impossible for you to return, or you have a fear of return. So there's a number of students from Turkey who this has happened to, even at our university. And then here is our southern border. So asylee may be knocking on our southern border and saying to a Customs Border Protection officer, I have a fear of return to my home country, I'd like to seek asylum in the United States. Things have changed substantially for every single one of these people. Through our history, the United States has accepted more refugees than any other country in the world. But over the past 2 years, that's changed dramatically. In 2016, we admitted 85,000 refugees, close to that number. And this is a number set by our executive with approval from Congress, but our executive has control of this number. And then you can see they substantially decreased over the next few years, down to 2020, which will be a ceiling of 18,000. This is not because the number of refugees have decreased around the world. Actually, this is the number of refugees around the world are higher than it's ever been. And this started in the fiscal year of October, but in our first month of 2020 in this fiscal year, we've accepted 0 refugees from around the world. So we might not meet that 18,000 number anyway. So the UN will call the U.S. They don't call the U.S. There's formal ways, but let's pretend they're calling the U.S. Do you have any room for refugees? And our government right now is saying no, even though they've already been defined and received refugee status outside of the United States. We are now not allowing refugees into the United States, and hopefully that will change soon. But you may have noticed, or any of you who have connections with refugee services, most of them have closed. Not because there aren't refugees that need their services, it's just refugees that need their services are not in the United States. So what we have seen additional changes for are how asylees are being processed in the United States as well. We used to see every month about 10 to 20 people seeking asylum detained at Dodge every month. Now we're seeing 1 or 2. And that's because the process of being even admitted into detention in the United States to receive asylum has become almost impossible. So I want to tell you a little bit about one of the people that we represented who was detained at Dodge. And this case concluded about a year ago exactly. So Matteo was from Cuba. And we met him in August of 2018. And he was detained at Dodge County Correctional Facility. You can see a little bit from his journey. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is Cuba. He flew to Guyana. Does anybody know why he flew to Guyana and not directly to the United States? Most people around the world can't get visas to fly directly to the United States. So you always wonder, why are people applying at the southern border? Why don't they just fly into Chicago and ask for asylum? They can't get visas into the United States because you have to prove you have non-immigrant intent. And someone who's fearing persecution in their home country, it's very difficult to prove that you have non-immigrant intent to get a visa, to get on a plane, and to then be flown to the United States. So Matteo did the only thing he could do. He, after being persecuted in Cuba for speaking out against the communist government, where he couldn't find a job, and he was detained twice by Cuban police, beaten. He flew with scars on his body, on his arms, and on his face. Flew to Guyana and then traveled by foot from Guyana all the way to the southern border into where he arrived in Matamoros, Mexico, right here, one of the most dangerous cities in the world. It's actually, our Department of State has deemed it a level 4 danger zone, the same that we gave Kabul, Afghanistan, and all of Syria. So he arrived there, but at the time, Matteo knocked on the door, the Custom Border Protection officer, and told the officer that he wanted to apply for asylum. And showed the scars on his body, explained why he wanted to apply for political asylum. And so prior to 2018, Cubans were generally just paroled into the United States because they have very strong cases that our government has recognized. But as of last year, they're not. Matteo was placed in a detention facility in Dodge County Correctional Facility, where my students met him and begged me if they could help him. And we did. So we represented him. We worked for about 2.5 months to prepare his application for asylum and all of the supporting documentation. So we had country reports, we had expert reports from actually a PhD student here at UW who wrote an expert report explaining why he would be persecuted if he was returned to his home country. And then we went to a hearing in Chicago in front of an immigration judge, and after about 2 hours, the immigration judge approved his case for asylum with And from detention to about 2 hours later, he was released in a t-shirt and his jeans and sandals in November in Chicago. And that was his welcome to the United States. But thankfully, we went and got him sweatshirt and everything like that. And but then he hopped on a bus and reunited with his family in Florida. That's how asylum happened about a year ago. But since then, if Matteo had taken the same journey, he wouldn't qualify for asylum anymore. Even though, again, no laws have changed, just policies. And I'll explain that in a little bit. So these are my students in Chicago after they granted asylum, and we dropped them off at the bus station. So 3 of these students, she is still working with me, and these 2 in their 3rd year of law school, but both of them are going to be working at large law firms here in Madison next year, and won't be practicing immigration law, but both of their firms have agreed to allow them to take on asylum cases pro bono as part of their agreements for working there. So I'm hoping that continues as well. So as these policies have changed, I want to talk a little bit about how this law in action and how we've taken the Wisconsin idea outside of Wisconsin. Obviously, Matteo is from outside of Wisconsin, but there are people who need our help in the United States that are detained closer to the border. And so this is the map. It doesn't quite go there. It got a little bit cut off. But the students, 1 year, they drove from the law school all the way down to Dilley, Texas, which is about 21 hours in car. I flew, I'll admit it. But they drove. And then this past year when we went, we were able to get funding for them to fly. Because we, when we go down there, we work in a detention facility for women and children for 7 days, from 8 a.m. in the morning till, who knows, usually about 14-hour days in a detention facility with women and children who are seeking asylum. So this is all a volunteer trip for law students. So we go during their 2-week summer break. Most of them get 2 weeks off right before we start in the fall, and they take time off to travel to volunteer in Texas, where you need to be bilingual, you need to be have a lot of energy, and you need to be prepared to see trauma. So the South Texas Family Residential Facility in Dilley, Texas, houses up to 2,400 women and children who have presented themselves or cross at the southern border or cross the southern border without inspection. And then they're housed in this detention facility to process for asylum. And it's to prepare them for what's called their credible fear interviews. Credible fear interview is the first process into applying for asylum. Our laws say that if you can show that you have a credible fear of return to the United States, showing you have a substantial chance of receiving asylum in front of an immigration judge in the United States, you can then apply for asylum in the United States. And so that's what we do when we're there. The need for attorneys down there is huge. The detention center has 2,400 women and children, and they're processing. They have about 2 days to prepare for this credible fear interview. There are 2 lawyers that work there full-time. Otherwise, they depend on volunteers at all times. And so what was really incredible last summer, they take 15 volunteers every week, and it's a week-long program because they need you to commit for that long so you can learn what the process is and everything like that. We had 14 bilingual UW law students who volunteered for a week down there. We had more than that applied. So there's a huge interest in providing this types of service, these emergent services, to outside of Wisconsin, because we don't have any detention facilities for women and children, thankfully, in Wisconsin, but at least the law students are able to use the skills that they have learned here and take them to the border where they're in great need. And next year we will be doing 2 trips. We've only been doing 1 trip every year. Next year we'll be doing 2 trips because there's such an interest in this volunteer work and such a need. So we're going that. These are just a few of the students that look really bright-eyed and happy at this time, but really mostly time we cried a lot, but they're great. So most of the women and children, so they come from the Northern Triangle of Central America. And they've made this dangerous journey because they're mostly fleeing domestic violence or gang violence or violence, persecution from their home governments. Many of the women that we meet with, they are fleeing violence by MS-13, Mar Salvatrucha 13, or Barrio 18. They're both street gangs that are really have control of almost every neighborhood in each of these countries, and the police and military are unable to control them. Oftentimes, you would ask the woman, how do you know it was MS-13? And they would talk about tattoos. It's very well known of which areas are being controlled by which gang and what type of persecution that they are inflicting on these people. But these are a little bit about the journey that they take, and it's a really dangerous journey for children. But I always say, people ask, why would these women put their children in danger of traveling through Mexico, which is also often controlled by certain gangs. And what I've witnessed is really they have no choice. And part of that is really bearing witness to what these women and children say to you before they've had any sort of legal consultation, any sort of educational background. Many of them haven't gone to college or anything like that. But I can tell you that I don't believe any of them in their stories that they have ever lied to me, because they're so innocent and they're so desperate and their stories are told with such detail, and it's pretty harrowing. And one of the things that that we tell the students is, once the women and children have arrived at this detention facility, they've already crossed through countries to get to the southern border. Then they're arrested by Custom Border Protection Officer, put in what's called a perera, a doghouse, for 5 to 7 days, then transferred to an helera, an ice box, which is temperature controlled to be very cold by policy. And then they're transferred to the South Texas Residential Facility or Detention Center, and guarded by CoreCivic, which is a private billion-dollar prison company in the United States. And our students and the volunteers there are really the only first people that they see that are there to serve them. And so oftentimes it's just powerful for our students just to say, welcome to the United States. We believe you. We trust you. We're here to help you. But it takes a while for some of them to even believe or understand who we are, because some of the women and children haven't seen anyone willing to help them for months. So what I discussed a little bit before is this this regulatory wall. We've all heard the calls for build the wall, build the wall. And really what has happened is there is a policy wall that has been built on our southern border that's not brick and mortar, but it's through executive action. And this is why some of our work from the law school has taken us even south of the border, because many of the asylum seekers are now forced to remain in Mexico through some of these policies. This is just a map of some of the fencing in the wall that already exists, the physical wall. But I want to talk a little bit more about some of these policy walls. So you guys probably all remember in 2018 in this picture from the Washington Post of family detention and then really family separation. So right before we arrived in Dilley in the summer of 2018, it was the end of the executive order ending family separation, but there were 50 women and children that were detained there who had just been reunited. So we started seeing and working with families that were who had just been reunited after being separated. Their children were placed in detention facilities separate from their mothers. And this experience traveled with us back to Wisconsin, as we represent a number of parents and their children who were separated or permanently separated from their parents during family separation. So we represent a 15-year-old who was from Honduras. She was separated from her father and placed in, this is a picture of the Homestead Detention Facility in Florida for 6 months. And her father was deported back to Honduras. And she had an uncle here in Wisconsin who was willing to take her in, to house her, to feed her, to make sure she goes to school, and the government didn't release her for over 6 months. With the help of another organization, we've been able to get the father to in the United States, and they've been reunited, and now they're in the process of applying for asylum. The father has a very strong case for asylum. I don't have any idea why he was first deported, and we asked the government for those documents through the Freedom of Information Act, and they came back blank. So we don't know what has happened. Either the government lost them or doesn't want to share them with us, but we're going to keep trying. We also represent a 14-year-old boy who was detained in New York for 6 months. His father was permanently separated, and we haven't been able to reunite him, but he is living with a family member here in Wisconsin now. We also represent a mom and now her 4-year-old daughter. They were separated for 8 weeks. The daughter was 3 years old at the time. The mother never knew where she was during that time, and the mother was ordered deported because at her credible fear interview she could hardly speak because all she wanted to know was where her daughter was. So we are still working with them to hopefully help them seek asylum and receive some sort of relief from what they've suffered. But without the Immigrant Justice Clinic, these people probably wouldn't have representation because they don't have the means to hire an attorney. So Law in Action now moves south of our southern border, and I want to explain a little bit why that is. So there are 3 major policies that have occurred that my students and I have been studying here in Wisconsin, and also as we've started to volunteer in Mexico. So there's something called metering, which isn't a formal policy, but it's something that's occurring. The Migrant Protection Protocols, which now forces most Central American families to remain in Mexico while they seek asylum in the United States. And then the Safe Third Country Transit Ban, which has pretty much stopped asylum for anybody arriving on the southern border. And I'll talk about it a little bit more. But if someone has arrived at the southern border, someone like Matteo, who I talked about, Matteo from Cuba, who had passed through a third country after he left Cuba, now, because if he had arrived now, he'd be barred from getting asylum because he didn't apply for asylum in another country prior to arriving at our southern border. And that's what the Safe Third Country Transit Bar is doing right now. I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail and why it's important. So we have had to do a little bit more traveling outside of Wisconsin to learn about these policies because it's hard to know the truth of what's going on without actually seeing it in person. So I've been volunteering with an organization in Tijuana called El Otro Lado, and they provide services to people seeking asylum who are in Tijuana and then looking to present themselves for asylum at the San Isidro port of entry in the United States. So this is what's called metering, and I'll tell you a little bit about this. So when I talked about Matteo, I said how he arrived in Matamoros, Mexico, that really dangerous city. He was able to present himself for asylum the same day that he got there. Now, when asylum seekers arrive at a port of entry, they can't ask for asylum the same day. Our Customs Border Protection officers tell them that they need to go to the Mexican government and get one of these numbers. So this is a post-it note that Grupos Beta gives out when someone arrives in Tijuana and they want to apply for asylum. And this is happening at almost every port of entry on our southern border. So this was the first time I went down in March of 2019. And this is the plaza near the port of entry. And in the morning, it fills up with people who have just arrived in Tijuana and they want to get their number. And once you get your number, at the time in March, they were waiting about 3 weeks when they arrived in Tijuana to present themselves. Now they're waiting 2 to 3 months. In Tijuana, which is also not, it's a beautiful city. I love visiting there, but I think as someone without money and without connections, it's not that I have a lot of money at all, but I have the means to travel safely through there. But people who are arriving there can be targets for gangs and for drug cartels, which are very persistent there, and the number of kidnappings have increased substantially. So once you arrive at the port of entry, then you get a number and you're forced to wait there until your number is called. There's nowhere to find these numbers except from nonprofits that are in the area, and the nonprofit that I volunteer with, they post the number on their door every day. So once their number is called, then you are then preparing to present yourself to be placed into detention for at least 7 days in the United States, even these children. So they arrive at this other place, and right behind here is where vans are for Customs Border Protection officers. When you meet with the families there, we make sure that they have warm clothing because they're going into the hilera, and you can only have one layer of clothing. So if a woman is wearing a sweater with a tank top under them, you make sure she takes off the tank top because otherwise they're going to take her sweater. You make sure that the babies have warm socks. You make sure that they know how long they may be in detention. And then you make sure that they know that they don't, how to keep records of their numbers, and also the name and the date of their parents. Because our government is still separating women and children, and parents and children in general. So if there was ever a parent with children going into detention, we would write the name of the parent and her date of birth or his date of birth on the arm of the child in permanent marker to ensure that it's less likely that our government would separate them and not know how to get them reunited. Because when child separation happened, and is still happening, our government does not have a proper way of reuniting families and children. And then if there was adults traveling, you would write down, if they had an aunt or a friend in the United States who was going to sponsor them, you would write down the address and the name and the phone number for that individual. Okay, so then they would process for asylum, and some of them would be placed in detention in the United States, but then some of them are being placed on what's called the Migrant Protection Protocols. And the Migrant Protection Protocols requires, it would require someone like Matteo, who I talked about before. He wouldn't be placed in detention in the United States, but would be forced to go back to Matamoros, Mexico, and wait for his asylum hearing in the United States. So they're waiting there without really the ability to work, without safety, without family, and then are brought across to these courts in the United States, these tent courts, in armored vehicles, and are guarded by armed guards the entire time while they're trying to present themselves in immigration court. Yeah.
How do they feed themselves if they're sitting around waiting for the number to come up?
There are a lot of shelters that are sponsored now by a lot of nonprofits in the United States. So in Matamoros, Mexico, there's a church that does a lot of providing food, and there's some shelters in Mexico. The United States has provided some money to provide shelters, but I believe it's only to provide shelter for about up to 8,000 people. And right now in Migrant Protection Protocols, there's over 40,000 people. So it's really scary. And I haven't been to Matamoros, Mexico. I often get invited to go and volunteer there, but right now I admittedly am just a little bit nervous to go. And that feels awful because I can probably provide some services. So it's just, but if I'm scared to go somewhere, most people are probably scared. I'm not super brave, but I just am very moved by, I just feel like this is the time that I need to do as much as I can. So this is a picture of kind of a tent city in Matamoros, Mexico, and it's become untenable for many of the people. There's no sewer, so there's a lot of healthcare workers down there trying to ensure that people are staying healthy, but it's really hard. So one of the clients that we represented this past summer is from Venezuela. Many of you probably know Venezuela has the largest number of asylum and refugee seekers right now in the world, besides Syria, I believe. But one of the families that we worked with, they started their journey, well, first they started their journey in Venezuela, and then they traveled to Peru because their husband had, or the father of the family had spoken out against the government because of the treatment of pretty much everybody. And he was beaten and almost killed and jailed. And so then he decided that he needed to flee. His life was in danger. So he first traveled to Peru with his family because they wanted to go back. They love Venezuela. That's where they grew up. Their whole family was there. It was a beautiful country for them for a very long time. But they couldn't stay. So they went to Peru hoping things would change in Venezuela, but it didn't. And after a while in Peru, because Peru has accepted so many Venezuelans started being persecuted as well. So after his wife was beaten and while she was with her son, they flew to Mexico because they had the money to do that. They could fly to Mexico, but not to the United States. And then they traveled to Tijuana, where they had nothing, but they were able to work with El Otro Lado, the organization, to then prepare themselves to present themselves at the border. And they waited for about 6 weeks in Tijuana, where someone helped them find a safe apartment for 6 weeks, but they felt very unsafe and scared. But after they processed for 7 days in the Hilera, they weren't placed on the migrant protection protocol because they're from South America, and most people from South America aren't put on that MPP program. But they were allowed to come into the United States because they had family here in Wisconsin. And so then the organization Tijuana asked us if we could represent them. And so the students prepared them for immigration court. We usually would have 2 years to prepare for an asylum hearing, but now with these newly arrived families, they're put on this expedited hearing. So we had 6 weeks to prepare an entire asylum application. And thankfully, through the University of Wisconsin and through our resources, we were able to get an expert to prepare, because the students are with me full-time during the summer, so they're able to prepare something that most attorneys couldn't do because we have the resources at the law school, and the students are passionate and dedicated to do this. So we went to our hearing in August. It was about a 4-hour hearing. We had an expert from Venezuela, one from Peru, explaining why they were persecuted in Peru. They interviewed the husband and the wife, and then at the end, the judge finally said, I believe you, I want to grant you asylum, but the government hadn't processed their fingerprints. So the judge couldn't grant asylum that day and had to give us a new hearing, which is tomorrow. So we're going down there, and hopefully the judge will officially grant asylum tomorrow. This is a picture of the students after the hearing, and these are clients with hearts on their faces, just because of confidentiality. But we still felt very happy after that hearing, but we will feel much happier tomorrow if all goes well. But the judge did tell the government that they failed at their duty to comply with the fingerprints. But it was August till now. The clients want to believe that they're going to get asylum, but it's been really hard for them. And because they haven't had the ability to work either, they're legally work, they've been relying on the charity of many others. So now the Safe Third Country Transit Ban. And again, this is something that Matteo and our clients from Venezuela would not be eligible for asylum if this was in place when they applied for asylum. So if you cross through basically if you're arriving at the southern border and you're not from Mexico and applying for asylum, you're now barred from getting asylum unless you applied for asylum in another country, which is almost impossible because most of these countries in Central America don't have enough immigration officers or even a process to apply for asylum. All these policies are being litigated in court, and we are also working on litigating them, but first we have to start at the immigration court level, and if the immigration judge denies any of them, then we'll be appealing them through the process, which is another really powerful component of the Immigrant Justice Clinic, because we can stick with a case forever. And some of these will maybe last forever. But a lot of private bar attorneys, if someone takes an asylum case and they spend $10,000 or $15,000 on that and they lose, they don't have another $10,000 or $15,000 to continue with the appeal process. One of our clients now, he is from Cameroon. And we met him at the Dodge County Correctional Facility in August of 2019. So almost exactly a year after we met Matteo from Cuba. And he flew from, so he is what's called an Anglophone in Cameroon. I don't know how many of you know what's going on in Cameroon, but there is marginalization of the English-speaking minority, and our client was almost killed by his government for peacefully protesting against the marginalization of English speakers. And so he fled Cameroon through Nigeria, and he flew to Ecuador, the only place he could fly without a visa. And then once he arrived in Ecuador, so he's English speaking, okay, not Spanish speaking at all. He speaks French too, but he flew to Quito and then made a dangerous journey all the way through Central America, South America, and he arrived in Matamoros, Mexico, same place that Matteo arrived in. But when he arrived, they were metering people. And he went up to Customs Border Protection officer and explained that he wanted to apply for asylum, and they said, no, you need to go get a number. So he was left with two options. Wait in Matamoros, Mexico, because he didn't have any money to get anywhere else. Wait in Matamoros, Mexico, or try to cross without inspection, so try to cross illegally. But our client, he wouldn't do that. He's tried to do everything under the law. He studied the asylum laws before leaving Cameroon. But in his 6 months journey to get to our southern border, things had changed so substantially that he had no idea really what was going on. What is metering? What is migrant protection protocols? What is safe third country transit ban? And so he arrived in Matamoros, Mexico, and he tried to wait there for 6 weeks. So he arrived in June, and after 6 weeks, one night he was almost kidnapped, and he was beaten by a drug cartel because the cartels are known for kidnapping people and then extorting their families who are either in the United States or in their home country for money, and then they'll release the individual. But he was so scared, he was beaten and so injured, he went and tried to ask the Customs Border Protection officer if he could please come into the United States. Not come into the United States and be free, but to be placed in detention in the United States. So there are two pedestrian bridges in Matamoros, and he walked to one, put his hands in the air, and walked across and explained to the Customs Border Protection officer that he thought he would be killed if he was forced to wait in Matamoros, Mexico. And thankfully, the Customs Border Protection officer believed him, and they processed him for asylum. That same night, the Customs Border Protection officer asked him, why do you believe that you would qualify for asylum? And he said, because I believe the United States is a country that is known for its humanity. And from then, he was placed in Dodge County Correctional Facility where we met him, and he was detained for about 2 months. He wasn't eligible for bond. Some people can get bond, but he wasn't eligible for bond because he presented himself at the border. But there's one way we could get him out of detention, something that ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, never does. But because we had the resources and the will of these students, they applied for something called parole. And he was able, because he had a U.S. citizen sponsor here in the United States, a cousin, because we promised to represent him pro bono no matter where he went into the United States, and because he had a perfect behavioral record in detention, the ICE officer called us and said, you have 12 hours to get to Chicago, we're letting him out tomorrow morning. So because of, doesn't mean he's getting asylum, it doesn't even mean he has the right to work in the United States, it just means he's not going to be detained. So the students and I drove down, and he was released from detention, and I've never seen someone so happy. But his wife and his child are still in Cameroon, and he's extremely worried about them. And now we're still waiting for his asylum hearing. And before all these new policies, this was the strongest asylum case I've ever seen in my 15 years of practicing. So it's really hard to explain to the students why this is going on right now, but I'm grateful that we have the resources and the ability to continue to work on cases like this and to serve our clients in that way, because the students are really are quite dedicated. I want to leave some time for questions, but I just want to tell you about one more journey that we're taking to the southern border in Tijuana in a few weeks. When I was in Tijuana in August, I met with a couple, same-sex couple from Cuba. And I'd represented a lot of Cuban clients, so they asked me while I was there if I could do their consultation, which I was happy to do. They were interviewed separately, because that's how we do it, just do consultation separately. And he somehow, I said, if sometime our paths cross again, this would be wonderful, but I don't know where I'll be, I don't know where you'll be, but this is the process of what you're preparing for. He has HIV, so it was really difficult for him to decide to wait in Mexico. He said, I don't have a choice, I'll die if I stay here. And I don't know how, I know ethically what I can tell him, and that's not that he can't break the law. And that's all I could say. But he contacted me about 6 weeks ago. I have no idea how he found me. He Googled Erin Immigration, blonde attorney, Wisconsin. I have no idea. Somehow he found me, and he's still waiting for his number to be called. And they were able to get, in Mexico, I guess you get 3 months of medication when you're there, and so, but it's about to run out, but he's about to present himself at the border. So what we're trying to do is demonstrate why he shouldn't be placed in the migrant protection protocols in Mexico, because his life will be in danger, and that he should be either released into the United States or placed in detention in Dodge County Correctional Facility so that we can represent him. Immigration will probably laugh at my letters or tear them up, I don't know. But we're gonna try. And that's what we're going to do. And one of my students, or 2 of my students and I, are going to go down there and see them if timing works out before they present themselves at the border, just to make sure that they're safe. And then we don't know where their journey is going to be, but we're hoping to continue to represent them through the whole process. But they do have the Safe Third Country Transit Bar, where again, prior to that, they would really have an incredibly strong asylum case where a judge would probably have approved it within 45 minutes of testimony. So as of today, the number in this couple's number is 3710. That's what their little Post-it note says. And as of today, they called 3542. Each number is 10 people, so we don't know exactly when they're going to get called, but we're trying to figure it out when we can go down there to meet with them. And this is just the chaparral, the port of entry, where they'll be presenting themselves for to be placed into, hopefully, detention or into the United States. But there's a need for immigration attorneys everywhere in Wisconsin, on the southern border, now south of our southern border, and we're trying to not only provide the representation to a very few, but also to learn and to study and understand how these policies are really affecting people in our country and people who are seeking refuge in our country, as it's really possibly going to change the fabric of our country. And with the will and the dedication of the law students, we're able to make, at least provide some sort of due process and access to justice to a small few. It's not enough, but as we continue to teach students how to practice this type of law, we're hoping that the representation of people on both sides, our government as well as people we're representing, will continue to benefit the people around the globe. So this is just a picture. Again, my students are always smiling, and I don't know, they're not always smiling, but this was our last night in Dilley, Texas. This was the group of 14 students who went down there. Many of them are first generation themselves. Some of them are refugees themselves. One of them is he's a foreign national student, and he just believes in providing this representation. But they will graduate all with some trial experience. They'll also know what it's like to work with people in detention. But we have students that go and they practice for the government. They may be asylum officers, so they're determining whether someone qualifies for asylum. I have a student who's now working for Immigration Customs Enforcement, where that's not the choice I would make for my career. I know that they're leaving the University of Wisconsin with a really strong background in terms of fairness and in terms of the law and in terms of humanity. So it gives me some hope that will continue. We also have a lot of students that are private bar attorneys, and then a number of students that become nonprofit or non-governmental attorneys. And so we have found a really good home at the law school and at Wisconsin, and I think the community has been a huge resource for us as well. And we will continue to do what we can to serve the community that we are attempting to serve, regardless of where we're taken, because it might take us to Guatemala next, because asylum seekers are being sent to Guatemala now to wait for their asylum hearings. I just want to end by reading this poem that one of my students wrote, and he is the one who is, he's on a student visa now. So he wrote this after he had his first hearing in court, and he called it Immigration Court. Facing an immigration judge, foreign passport in my pocket. In my heart there is no grudge. My name is not in her docket. I face no fear nor despair. I am there as an attorney. I am not in the client chair. At stake is not my journey. It could be the other way. It could be my own proceedings. That could be me there someday. It could be me that is pleading. But if it ever comes to be, if it's ever me that's tried, I hope, for the life of me, to have a lawyer by my side. So that's all I have for you guys.
So we do have some time for questions, and I want to ask one quick question first. And if you could tell us briefly how you came to be in a position yourself to be doing this kind of work.
So I went to undergrad here as well, and I was going to be a special education teacher. That was my goal. But in my fourth year, I did a practicum. I decided to look at the State Public Defender's Office. And so during my senior year of college, every morning I went to the Dane County Jail, and from 8 to noon every day, and I loved it. I don't know what was wrong with me, but I loved it. My friends thought I was nuts because they all had fun, and I was on my way to the jail every morning. But what I noticed was there were a lot of people who didn't know what their status was, and a lot of people who didn't speak English. And so I spoke Spanish at the time, not fluent by any means, but I became the only person that was really a lifeline for them while they were detained. And so when I saw that, it just kind of became, I thought about, wow, this might be a good place for me to use my education and my privilege to have a career that I really believe in and to serve a population that deserves competent access to justice. And so then after that, I took a year to work in Quito, Ecuador, where I worked for a nonprofit there. and worked with, at the time there were a lot of refugees coming from Colombia because of the FARC. And so I helped them resettle in Quito. And then I also worked with a lot of families who had family members, Ecuadorians who had family members in the United States. And they would, say, we got, our $20 from our tia in New York. And that was really how a lot of them survived. But we also learned that there was probably no way that these little girls that I was teaching would ever actually meet their tia in New York. So it just kind of became. And then I went to law school, and I've been practicing since immigration law since the day I graduated from law school. Yeah.
So it just turns out there was someone on public radio today talking about this very same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And she was talking about this number system, and she was asked, because apparently the way the people who have the numbers, there's no really good way for them to find out when their number is called.
Right.
So the question was, if someone's number is called and they don't realize it, and so then they don't show up for that interview, what happens to them? Do they start over? Do they need to get a new number? And the person who was being interviewed said, we have no idea. So do you know the answer to that question?
I only know from what I've learned from the organization that I volunteer with in Tijuana that if you miss your number, you can go, the next day and ask them to call it, and they may. I mean, there's no guarantee. I mean, they're keeping numbers in like a spiral notebook. It's not in a computer. There's no official process through all of it. So I think you're kind of just at the mercy of, I don't even know who. But just hoping that someone will forgive you. Yeah. But the organization in Tijuana that I do work with, they post the numbers every day, so I get to see them, so that I know for the people we're working with down there how to advise them, so they don't have to necessarily travel there every day to see. Yeah.
Could you please talk a little bit about the status of the policies being regulated in the courts, and where that's at right now, or in your role?
Yeah. So many of these policies, including the migrant protection protocols and the Safe Third Country transit ban, they are at a lower court level and are being moved through the court process, which will probably end up at the Supreme Court at some point. But both of these, which was, there was another policy that before was, some people say it was Asylum Bar 1.0, that said if you crossed the southern border without inspection, you're barred from getting asylum. Courts, there's an injunction on that one. And so that was one of the first ones that was implemented. And then migrant protection protocols, the one that forces people to stay in Mexico during the process, we thought the same thing would happen, that it would be allowed to process through the courts, but there would be an injunction on it, but it wasn't. The Ninth Circuit, where most of these are being litigated, they allowed migrant protection protocols to process, to be implemented while these make its way, while they make their way through the courts. Same with the Safe Third Country transit ban. When we arrived in Dilley, Texas, the last week of August, there had been an injunction on the Safe Third Country transit ban, but 3 days before we arrived, that injunction was removed for anyone outside of the Ninth Circuit, so that means Texas, where we were. So it was the first 3 days of that bar being implemented, and it was just shocking how many, I mean, everybody was barred from asylum because of that. And so we probably won't receive a decision from the Supreme Court on any of these for quite a while. I'm not a bearer of good news, really.
I had never heard about the icebox procedure, and
yeah.
I'm just wondering how long that's been going on, and do they offer any kind of rationale for that?
It's been, I don't know exactly how long it has been a procedure, but I believe since, probably since family detention started, which was, or the South Texas Family Residential Facility was in 2014. So I know at least since then. I don't know specifically why. I know that a reporter that I had talked to asked one of the CBP officers when she was in one of the facilities, what can't they just increase the temperature a degree or two? And he just said it's policy. It's in their manual or whatever it is. It's part of the law. And I have an idea of why that is, but I can't really I don't know for sure. So, but it's cold.
Please join me in thanking Erin for a very interesting and important